I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Adam Curry, a tech entrepreneur, startup founder, and AI developer focused on AI, embedded systems, and frontier science. Adam is the Senior Vice President of Software and Data at Bluon, which leverages his strengths in the product development lifecycle from R&D to growth stages for both hardware and software applications. He's also the director of Entangled Labs and creator of the Entangled app, a unique consciousness research tool utilizing a mobile app connected to quantum hardware. Adam grew up in the consciousness research community at places like Princeton's Pear Lab and has applied his expertise in technology and engineering to help expand the boundaries of knowledge about the universe and about ourselves. So, Adam, welcome. It is a true pleasure to have you with me today, sir.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be with you. I really enjoy your channel.
Yeah, I am really excited about this app that we're going to be talking about today. There is a lot going on in consciousness research right now, and technology is enabling so much of that. I've covered the Global Consciousness Project in the past. I just recently did an interview with Peter Mary with Weird Technologies. And so your technology is yet another approach, and it is a unique, independent approach. That's even more important. So again, I am super, super excited. So today we are discussing the detection and measurement of consciousness effects using the Entangled app that you have developed. So let me begin by asking, what inspired you to develop this app?
Well, when I was a kid, I started going to science conferences focused on the big weird questions, consciousness and UAPs and so forth. And I met some of the leaders of consciousness research community and became interested would be an understatement, but I was really enraptured by it and had the opportunity to become an intern at Princeton's Pear Lab for a while, which was exploring consciousness research through the use of random number generators. And at some point, a few years later, some alumni of the lab got together and created a little R&D company called Celeron. And the purpose of Celeron was to, if you will, democratize random number generator research. And what we did is we created low-cost random number generators. Previously, they had been very expensive, these large devices, and we thought maybe there'd be a couple dozen labs that would be interested, and maybe a few independent investigators. But it turns out there's quite a bit more interest in the subject matter, and so that led us to create consumer products based on random number generators. So, for example, we had a desk lamp called the Mind Lamp, which was a color-changing lamp that has a random number generator inside, and a few other things. And the purpose of that was not so much to be heavy on the research, but to bring these interesting concepts, the notion that consciousness is somehow connected to the physical world, and you can see the effects of your intention in real time, to the general public in a more fun format. Along those lines, we started this would be 2010, 2011. And mobile apps were the next big thing, right?
Okay, yeah.
So it became, clear to me anyway, clear to us that the distribution problem in technology had been solved by the iPhone.
Yeah.
So with smartphones, you solve the distribution, and so you can create software and have it distributed immediately to users. And that approach seemed like it would be the future, or one of the futures for psi research, for large-scale distributed psi research. And so we created this project to see if we could make a random number generator on a mobile phone, distribute it in a mobile app. And so over the course of about a year's effort, we did that and showed that we could get effects very consistent with everything else that we've seen in the decades prior. And so from that point, it was a question of what do we do with this, right? You could recreate the Global Consciousness Project, or you could create something like a version of that where you have people with a random number generator on their mobile phones that's sending data. But it also opened up the opportunity to explore those types of effects in a different way, I guess. And so that's the origin story of Entangled.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I'm jumping around in my questions a little bit because as I was going through research for this, and I might have missed something, so please correct me if I got this wrong. But in terms of construction and operation, global consciousness, which you mentioned, uses random number generators that are driven by reverse biased Zener diodes. I believe Peter Mary's work does something similar, although he is comparing the output of those in a different way, so his algorithm makes it unique. Your system, when I dug into this, it seems like it uses a very different approach. So Entangled is basically sending photons through more or less a beam splitter into two detectors where each photon is a random bit that is connected to a user account. So can you explain this for us in a little bit more detail, how this physically works and then how it's connected to, a remote user on a mobile app?
Sure. I should say that the research shows that it's not just photons or electrons that can be influenced by consciousness, but it seems to be any type of intrinsically random physical phenomena is susceptible to mean shift that correlates with people interacting with it. So at the Pear Lab, they had what's called a random mechanical cascade, where there were balls falling through pegs, thousands of balls, and you would try to mean shift it one way or the other. There are a number of other experiments like with water, but random number generators, like you mentioned, the Zener diode, and my system uses photons, tend to be the best, and they tend to be the best because they're low cost usually, and they're taking advantage of intrinsically random physical phenomena. So this is the quantum stuff. And that means that you can get a good baseline. So you can do better, more robust science. It's easier to isolate the potential other influences, outside environmental influences, and get a good solid baseline. So that's why they're used. Entangled is using, as you mentioned, a photon system. And again, there's nothing terribly special about that. It's just a different way of creating randomness. So you're right. You have a light source, and that light source is sending gazillions of photons at a half-silvered mirror, which is at a 45-degree angle. And some of those photons will travel through that mirror into one detector. Some of those photons will bounce off of that or be reflected by the silvery part of the mirror and into another detector. Mm-hmm. So this is a really standard way of creating a random signal. And so we have this apparatus, and it's sitting at our servers in Orange County. And the way that it works practically is that when a user downloads the mobile app, you can download Entangled to your phone. You create an account, and then that account is given an allocation of those bits. So we generate 1 bit per second per user and allocate that, if you will, into bins for each user. And then that data is analyzed, and we do meaningful things with it every hour. So this is different than other approaches like the Global Consciousness Project in some ways. It's, of course, very similar in some ways. But one of the ways it's different is each bit stream is allocated to an individual user. So that's one. And GCP in subsequent projects, GCP2, is generating tons of data, right? So they have a very high data generation bit rate, I guess. And with Entangled, I wanted to, so every bit is accounted for. It's highly structured because of the way that I wanted to do experiments. And so we have a very low bit rate, relatively speaking. 1 bit per user per second.
There is so much to unpack here. In fact, I've got about 20 questions that are kind of all competing for attention in my mind. So let me jump to the next one here, because when I was reading through the construction of this experiment, what hit me was, I said, this sounds a lot like a variation of the double slit experiment, right? And except in this case, user intentionality would slightly change the distribution of photons passing through each slit, at least if I'm interpreting that correctly. So then the next question that immediately came to mind was, is this a test, do you think, of the observer effect or something else entirely? And then I also wondered, as a corollary, could it be telling us that the observer effect can slightly influence quantum events in a different way, maybe a more general way than we've thought in the past?
It's a very good question. The short answer is I think this is something else entirely. The double slit experiment and the observer effect of the double slit experiment, which is to say the interpretation of observation collapsing the wave function,
Yeah.
is a good metaphor. However, I don't think that's what's going on. I don't think that's what's going on for a number of reasons, but one is that there's it's not clear. It's always only been one interpretation, that consciousness or the observer is collapsing the wave function, and it's not clear that that's correct. In fact, there are pretty good emerging theories that suggest that there's other things going on, not the observer effect. Now, that doesn't mean that psi isn't real or that a person's consciousness can't be influencing random bits in some other way. But for example, Penrose's work is suggesting that gravity is something that causes decoherence, which is the collapse. And that seems to be pretty good. And I think there's a few others, but I'm not a quantum physicist, so I can't go too deep on that. When I say quantum, if you read the website, I try to do it in a way that doesn't require something special about quantum to explain the mechanism by which mind can influence matter. I use quantum only to suggest that that's the way that we're generating random bits, which is to say it's a very good and robust way. When it comes to the mechanism, what's going on, we really don't know. I think that is still an open question. So we know that there's an effect going on because of the decades of research, but accounting for it is still work to be done.
Well, and if I could add to that, again, I am a case study in confusion on this, and this is something that I'm kind of realizing over time. I think that when you hear the word quantum, right, it's easy to kind of jump on the bandwagon and say, okay, consciousness influences quantum systems. But as you pointed out, and you did an excellent job of clarifying this, and Peter Mary said this to me, I think about 2 weeks ago as well. You can influence all manner of random systems, not just quantum systems. So this is kind of I believe you mentioned adjusting the statistical mean, shifting the statistical mean, right? Changing the probabilities of these inherently random systems, not necessarily just quantum, but all of them, right?
That's what the experiments seem to suggest.
Now, in terms of scalability, each node of this experiment can handle several users, from what I understand. You have mentioned being able to send millions of photons per second. That's on the website. And this still passes the NIST SP 800-22 compliance tests for randomness. So it's important to point that out. You are meeting internationally recognized standards for randomness in these experiments. You are trying to be as compliant as possible, and you have a lot of built-in headroom where you could scale this thing. So I'm wondering, what compared to distributed hardware systems like GCP, right, where each node is kind of with a person, you could potentially scale this with basically one single node or a small cluster of nodes in a central location to millions of people around the world simultaneously, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I should say that the the passing of the NIST tests, for example, the tests of randomness, that's just table stakes. Right? You've got to do that. I think the real test for experimental quality is up a level, meaning that there are some things that you really need to do if you're doing a formal experiment that I tried to capture in Entangled. One of those is that you really need to pre-state everything. That is to say, if you're running an experiment and you're looking for anomalous effects, what do you mean by anomalous effects? What is the significance threshold that you would require? How many bits? What is the success or failure criteria? Another one is you need to be clear on when your experiment starts and when it stops. You need to have those very, thoroughly pre-stated. Because if you're dealing with random numbers, there's a potential issue called optional stopping, which is where you could just generate a bunch of random bits and decide when to stop the experiment. Well, if you're stopping the experiment when it's deviating, like just through a random walk with nothing influencing it, it's going to look like there's some influence there. So you can't do that. So you have to pre-state everything before your experiments. And so one of the reasons why I chose 1 bit per second per user is that it makes the structure of these types of formal experiments very easy to handle. So one experiment that we're running, currently the only experiment, is one on earthquake prediction. And so we can predefine, what do you mean by an earthquake? Well, in this case, it's a magnitude 6.0 or above event that's registered in the USGS. And what is the time frame? Well, the time frame is 12 a.m. to 12 a.m. UTC time. If an earthquake happens in that time, it's counted as an event. And then the 24 hours before that, we're polling every user on the network. We can get into this, but each user generates a bit that is allocated to this experiment, and then we collect all of those bits, find the z-score, which is a statistical score, kind of how deviated or not it is. And if it's above a certain threshold that, again, is predefined, you could register that as a prediction. Yes, an earthquake that satisfies that criteria will happen in the next 24 hours, or no, it will not. And then we can automate this very easily through the use of APIs and so forth. Perhaps a third benefit is that it allows us to be very open with all the data. So if you look at the experiments through the app, for example, the outcome of the test is provided every single day and has been. So anyone who is a nerd can go and look at the data and see what's going on.
So is focused intentionality required for the Entangled app, or does it pick up larger scale trends like breaking news stories influencing the GCP experiment? And the reason I ask is there in some of these LAMP technologies, right? If I understand correctly, you focus intentionality on the LAMP, which somehow changes the randomness, and the LAMP can change intensity based on that. So there's kind of I wouldn't say that there's a mechanism, but there's at least a focus where you're saying, okay, I am going to change this over here, and that change happens. Whereas with GCP, you have news stories, right, that affect people's consciousness, but most of those people aren't aware that the GCP network even exists. So it's picking up something larger, maybe a group consciousness or something along those lines.
Entangled is opinionated. It's opinionated in that if you read the website or the app, there's an introduction to why we're opinionated and in what way. And one of them is that the effect is a subconscious effect. Meaning, while you can interact with random number generators using conscious intention, for example, in the lamps and so forth, and with the classic intention experiments, if you think about it, how does your mind know how to shift a bit in the first place?
Yeah.
I can't give you an instruction set for doing that, right? So there's something going on at a level that is below or above our conscious awareness, that seems to be driving the effect. So that's why I say it's subconscious. It's kind of hand waving, but I think people understand what I mean when I say that. So if it's a subconscious effect, then you don't need, with Entangled, for example, you don't need to be consciously aware of what's going on at every moment. Meaning a user doesn't have to consciously vote by tapping a button, for example, yes, I think it will happen, the earthquake will happen, or no. Nor do they have to consciously send their intention or something into the system to generate the effect. It's a set it and forget it kind of thing. Now, I think that being said, feedback is important, right? There's let's call it two competing theories for explaining these type of field consciousness data. One is that there is actually a consciousness field, or there's a physical field that consciousness is always influencing, kind of like ambient radio waves or something. And the random number generators are similar, are picking up on this somehow. Like it would still exist even if you had no random number generators.
Yeah.
So that's one perspective. Another perspective is that the effects that you're seeing are something like, we call them goal-directed effects, meaning the experimenters who set up the experiments, the participants, and everyone who hears about them, reading the stories or us talking or those listening to this podcast, have some sort of influence on the random number generators in some meaningful way that correlates with the events that you're looking at. In other words, it's more of an informational influence rather than a field influence that's spreading out. So, and people debate these things. Where I land on it, and this is the opinionated part, is, well, I know for sure that you can have goal-directed effects. And so I wanted to structure Entangled to really lean into the goal-directed nature. So for example, with GCP, Roger does a great job of being very rigorous. He will predefine what counts as a global event. And he's done a lot of really good and difficult, by the way, work to try to make that objective. With Entangled, you can structure questions in all the ways that I described previously, like with the earthquake experiment, for example. And everyone who's on the app is recruited into a goal-directed task, which is lend your subconscious mind to influence the bits that will tell the system yes or no in the case of the prediction.
Okay. Well, and let me get into actually some of those fundamental underlying assumptions. You just mentioned those. So on your website at entangled.org, and I want to repeat that because I want the audience to visit that and hopefully get involved. Entangled.org, you list a few underlying assumptions that are worth keeping in mind. Consciousness can access information across time and space. That is a giant underlying assumption there. Consciousness can influence the behavior of quantum systems, and the subconscious is the driver, as you just mentioned. So those are kind of the big three there. And the across time and space part was also interesting. I want to come back to that in the future because the next thing I wanted to ask was, using this app, what kind of results have you seen with it so far?
Yeah. So you listed the three assumptions that we're making. Consciousness can access information across time and space. Consciousness can influence random systems, and the subconscious is the driver. All of those are based on decades of research, and and a little bit of interpretation of those. We can get into why I say those three things later on, but you asked about results. Okay. So we're running one experiment in future prediction, which is the earthquake prediction experiment. Okay. And so that's the only experiment on which I can pronounce at this time. We have generated a little over 200 predictions, so we make one prediction per day. But we defined an experiment start and stop time as 90 days. So call it 3 months. So in the first 90 days, which is the only time period that I've done the full analysis, which is the first experiment, we made something like 90 predictions. And I think we correctly predicted 48 and earthquakes, and we missed or were incorrect on 40, I think, if I'm getting those numbers right. You can do a very simple chi-square test. And the chi-square test results suggest that, or show an effect size of z equals 0.7. I'll explain what that means. So a z-score is the distance from the mean in terms of standard deviations. So if you're looking at random data and there should be no influence on that random data, the effect size that you get a bell curve, right? A nice bell curve. And the middle would be p equals 0.05. That's a 50-50 chance of ones or zeros. And what we're seeing is a mean shift where the effect size is 0.7, which means that something like 1 in, I'm going to get the statistics wrong, but you'd have to do a number of these tests to get those effects by chance. So you could think of the z-score as, it's often used as a kind of way of talking about effect size, meaning the odds against chance of that outcome happening, something like that. 0.05 is typically regarded as statistically significant. There's different criteria that people use, but we chose 0.05, which means odds against chance of 20 to 1, or you'd expect this result or something like it to happen at least that often by chance. That means that the results are not significant. They're very close. They're almost as close as you could get, but they're not actually significant. So I thought that was kind of funny. But we have to be good scientists, and so currently, while interesting, the earthquake prediction results are not statistically significant by our own criteria.
Okay.
However, there's some other interesting things that I've seen in the data that are guideposts, I think, for where I'd like to explore more. I'm looking at earthquakes that happen anywhere in the world. We don't have entangled users everywhere in the world. We have them spread around, I think there's something like 7,000 right now, and we have pretty good coverage, but we don't have them all over the world. That means that an earthquake that happens in Togo or some island where there's no inhabitants may not be meaningful at all to an individual. So you could look at proximity to users and prediction success. And so if you look at earthquakes that happened near entangled users, you could say within a couple 100 kilometers, the prediction success increases. Another thing that I think is still to be explored, I have some anecdotal evidence for it, is that not everyone is good at this type of skill, this subconscious future prediction skill. Not everyone is good every time either. Some people tend to be very good at these things. Some people are good sometime and not other times. So in the parapsychological literature, you see similar effects. which is to say that there are a handful of very good people who tend to drive most of the results. While everyone seems capable of this at some level, this seems to be something like a talent or a skill that people have. So I'm looking at ways of maybe identifying psi talent or future prediction or precognition talent, and maybe biasing the voting to them, and also ways to explore the meaningfulness of predictions to individual users. I think if there is any one thing that I could share, having looked at so many of these studies and contemplated quite a bit the wide canon of psi research, it's that anomalies accumulate around meaningfulness in an experiment.
Okay.
Anomalies accumulate around meaningfulness in an experiment. You certainly see that with GCP, right? And you, I think, are seeing that in Entangled as well. But it kind of stands to reason. If our consciousness is somehow connected to the physical world, then events that are actually meaningful to us are more likely to be picked up. We can pause there, or I can give you maybe a couple of other examples about why this might be true.
Yeah. Well, actually, I would love to come back to that. I wanted to hone in on in fact, I highlighted it on my screen here, across time and space. And you just mentioned, like, if an earthquake happens on the island of Pogo, then, if no one is there, they may not know. Now, is that because they're not aware of it, or is that because of the distance, right? And the time aspect of this is even more interesting because, like many people, I've had precognitive dreams in the past. I think most people have had those. I realize that psychology has many, many explanations for pattern matching and fitting that supposedly explain that. But I think all of us have this idea that time is not exactly the way that we tend to perceive it in day-to-day life, right? And so that's something that's also very interesting and I think has been neglected overall. What are your thoughts on this? Is proximity is proximity to the event what matters? And I guess that would be time and space.
Well, I don't think physical proximity is what matters. That's the space component. But it tends to show up. But it tends to show up because if you're physically proximate to something, it's more meaningful to you, right? So again, back to this meaningfulness thing. One way to maybe understand this better is through the remote viewing research. So with remote viewing, a person is tasked on a target that might be distant in space. So it might be in another country, that describe something in another country, and the remote viewer can accurately describe that. And the results don't seem to be any better or worse if the physical target is closer to them. The thing that seems to mediate success, different opinions on this, is feedback. So if you get feedback of what the target actually was at some point in the future, this tends to increase accuracy. If you're viewing something where feedback is impossible, how do you even know that you're being accurate? So, for example, there are people that are remote viewing other planets or periods of time, millions of years ago, and it's like, how do you even know that you're accurate or not? That's fun. It's fun to do, but as far as like trying to understand the effect, it doesn't give you much to work with. There are like a couple different interpretations on the remote viewing stuff, which I think are really useful to know. One is that consciousness is actually somehow accessing information in time and space, meaning when you go and view a target, you're somehow retrieving information about that target across space because it's far away from you. Another perspective is that you're not going anywhere. What you're doing is you're viewing your future feedback. So when somebody says, here are the results of the, in a week, a week after you do the remote viewing, someone could say, here are the results of your remote viewing trial. And you look at the photo and you see that this is the target. A week before, when you were doing the remote viewing, you may have just been viewing your own feedback, meaning you're only traveling in your consciousness, which is to say that the time component is the loose one there. You're sort of moving through time, or time is more of the illusion there. And everything is kind of happening at once, but we have thankfully, we have memories that spread this experience of time out. Or we spread this experiences out, and that sort of creates time. I mean, it opens so many questions in terms of how you explain this, but those are two kind of primary ways of looking at it.
It does. And, again, I mean, like, since I've outed myself with these experiences, when I was a kid, I had dreams. I had a couple of very unique, very specific, it was always really mundane little things, right? But, just little stuff where it's like that could not possibly have been just a dream, that had to be precognitive, right? And then my mother actually had several examples with my grandmother. One of the most notable, and I've read about this happening in books, when my mother was much younger, she burned herself pretty badly cooking. And before she even had her hand under the cold water, the phone rang. And it was my grandmother, who was like 100 miles away, and said, "Bonnie, what's wrong? How are you hurt?" Right. And so, all of us have these anecdotal examples of things like this happening, where it goes through time and through space. We can't explain it, and we know that it happens, but, it becomes very difficult to really identify exactly what's going on. But from what you've said, it's meaning, right? You had a couple other examples.
Yeah, I think I think a shorthand for understanding this stuff is through meaning, right? You know, physicists have a difficult time with that one, because what is meaning to a particle? But everything is unfolding in our own consciousness, right? Including the idea of particles, including observations. I think that it's good to understand a class of experiments called precognition experiments, or sometimes called anomalous presentiment responses. So this is some excellent work done by Julia Mossbridge and Dean Radin and Spottiswoode and Michael Dugan. And this is where so in a psych lab at undergrad level 101, one experiment that people might do is connect an individual to some sort of stimulus and measure their response to the stimulus. So that could be their heart rate, or galvanic skin response, or skin conductivity. And so you could have a subject connected to something that's measuring the conductivity of their skin. And then you'll have a computer screen, and on that screen, they're being shown random images. Most of them are not emotionally provocative, but some of those images are emotionally provocative. So these would be like a tiger jumping at you, or somebody falling off a building, or something like that. And these images cause a subconscious reaction, meaning you might tense up a little bit, or the sweat glands in your finger might release, which increases the conductivity. And so you can measure a clear effect when these images are shown to people. So the anomalous presentiment response, or precognition experiments, reverse that. And they're looking for involuntary effects before the stimulus is shown to the individual. Meaning,
okay.
Does a person somehow sense the near future? Do they tense up a few seconds before being shown the image of the tiger? And there's many different versions of this, and the results are yes. It seems quite clear, actually, that humans can respond a few seconds before being shown some randomized stimulus, which is a demonstration of precognition. I mean, these are truly randomized stimuli. But it's not just humans. A similar experiment has been done with finches, birds. So a natural predator to a finch is a snake. So you can have a bird in a cage and a video camera that's recording call it the agitation or the movement of the bird. And you'll have a screen inside the cage with, again, random images. And every so often, at random, there'll be an image of a snake, its natural predator. Prior to being shown the image of the snake, the finches show greater agitation. It's as though they're anticipating being scared. It seems also to be true with insects. So there's another gentleman who did a study with earthworms. And again, looking at the movement of the earthworms, there was a speaker beneath the soil. And at random times, the speaker would send a vibration through the soil. And the earthworm behaves in a more agitated way just before that randomized stimuli. So I think those are really good experiments, and they're very important because they show that it's not just humans, but it seems to be innate to biology, or perhaps innate to consciousness itself, the ability to react to future stimuli, which makes sense, right? If you wanted to look at it from an evolutionary perspective, there could be no better adaptive advantage than the ability to anticipate the future, right? So it would make sense that you would see all life forms behaving in this way. And perhaps that those life forms that had some sort of precognitive ability would be selected for. So those traits would be carried on.
Those are amazing. Those are amazing stories. If you have more like that, I'm completely open to hearing them. But what you were saying about the evolutionary advantages it makes complete sense. And one of the challenges for me has been that mainstream science is either silent or dismissive of these effects in general, and has been for centuries, right? And one of the things that drives me nuts about that is virtually every single person on Earth has had some kind of strange experience that they can't explain. As you'd mentioned, a small group of people have them again and again and again and again. We know that something is going on that's beyond the bounds of traditional psychological explanations, right? And yet there's this schism that happens where science just won't acknowledge it to the point of studying it effectively. And so that really creates kind of this niche parapsychology community where this really should be a massive body of scientific research, right? I mean, this is something that affects us in a deeper and more implicit way than so many other things that have millions of scientists studying away at them around the globe. So I look at the work that you're doing, as well as GCP, as well as Weird Technologies, as a form of tiebreaker, right? Where you're able to basically kind of jam it down the throats of the mainstream and say, look, there is something here. You have to pay attention, right? And then, unfortunately, one of my worries is that this may be science moving forward one funeral at a time, where we just have to take time for people to begin to accept, hey, there's something here.
Well, I'm not personally a professional scientist, but there are a lot of very good professional scientists who are doing this work and doing very good work, and there are more and more of them. So while I think that what you describe is true, that there's been a bias against this type of research, not on the basis of the scholarship, but on the basis of the subject matter, what I've seen is that's changing.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and not due to my efforts, but due to the courageous work of many people who did the experiments and just stuck by the results, and a little bit of common sense too. I think that we're going to be moving more in. I think the stuff will become more mainstream, not just the consciousness research, but many of the other topics that you cover on your channel, right? Uh, Psi or UAPs or similar are kind of like portals into a realization that there are phenomena that are not captured in the standard model, right? And those phenomena are actually some of the most exciting things that you could study scientifically, right? They're exciting because they connect to our lived experience very closely, right? But they're exciting as well because it means that there are big discoveries still to be made in terms of the mechanisms, and there are new technologies as a result that can come out of this type of research. And those types of things are very attractive to scientists. It's just that I think that the reason why it's not been so broadly accepted in the mainstream, I mean, it's probably overdetermined, which is to say that there's a number of reasons for it. There's sociological reasons, there's funding reasons, there's tenure reasons, there's communication challenges. We're kind of coming out of what was a very successful materialist perspective on the way that the universe worked that enabled so many of our technologies, from computers to rockets and so forth. And I think we've kind of, particularly when we're trying to explain consciousness from that perspective, it hasn't been successful. And so we're somewhere in the process of moving beyond strict reductionist materialism and broadening the framework for understanding how the physical world operates in a way that I hope will and must actually recover many of the anomalies that have been well researched in decades past. And it will be for the benefit of everyone.
Yeah. Well, and as you've mentioned, I have seen more and more scientific research coming out. Dr. Edsel Cardania, I believe he did a meta study, right, of many other studies that seems to demonstrate that there are significant events there. It would also be nice, and I'm sure that these are out there, I don't know where any are, but it would be nice to see kind of a primer on what we know versus what we think we know, right? Like, I wasn't aware, you mentioned earthworms and canaries, I believe, as having what you might almost call precognitive knowledge, right? And so that's something I wasn't aware of. It would be wonderful to have basically a comprehensive document of, okay, this is what we think's going on right now. This is subject to change as we learn more.
Some of that work has been done. It's just not very well known. So I'll point to one. The Society for Scientific Exploration, which was a professional scientific society founded in 1980, I believe. The purpose of that was to create a critical forum for professional academics and scientists who are exploring unconventional things to share their research, to actually participate in peer review. So they've created a journal called the Journal of Scientific Exploration. Perhaps you've read it before. But
no, I'm not familiar with that.
It is the treasure trove that you're talking about. It's absolutely fantastic, and the work is quite rigorous as well. Everything in the journal has been peer reviewed, and some very, very good people. Edsel Cardania, you mentioned, was I guess still is a big contributor to the JSE.
Okay, so that's one example. So there is a lot that's been done. It's maybe just, again, getting it out to people more, right? And so if people have the interest, they can do the research themselves. Maybe part of it is just popularizing it better. And hopefully this podcast helps to do that, but there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Well, I think that's right. Not everyone is going to read a technical white paper, and that's fine. But that means that there's a communication gap that can be filled by those who do the primary research, reading the papers and so forth, and communicating that, why it matters, what their conclusions were, having guests on. I think I'm quite convinced actually that one of the reasons why this subject matter has become so popular is because of podcasting, right? It's it's the same. Many of the same scientists that have been publishing or doing the work for years, but they just haven't had the audience, right? And so there's been a generation or two of kids that didn't think that science was exciting because it wasn't dealing with the topics that they were actually interested in when they were young. The consciousness stuff, the UAP stuff, the energy stuff, etc.
Well, and one of the things that is most exciting for me is seeing a younger generation of people like yourself using computer technology, using AI, using detailed, computer-driven statistical analysis to do things that were kind of done with pencil and paper in the past, right? And so, like parapsychology, I mean, I think the heyday of it really started in like the late 60s through the 70s, right? But it was so kind of hands-on, right? They didn't have the tools that we have today. And so by being able to collect and process that data automatically, it feels like you're able to, I guess, elucidate these trends to a greater degree than in the past.
I think, for example, the use of AI as a research tool can be very helpful, but there's risks that it can actually be harmful in this capacity. Here's why. If you have a big large language model like a ChatGPT or something, it's going to be trained on publications. So it's going to be trained on peer-reviewed research in journals, which is great. However, what do you do about the fact that for decades, these types of anomalies research have been systematically excluded from the journals? Not always. There's some that get by, but a lot of it has been excluded. And it's not because the scholarship is poor. It's just, again, on the basis of the subject matter. Well, you could end up in a situation where the large language models exclude those data as well as part of its training, which means you only reinforce the kind of standard model that, while great in many ways, is still missing this big component of the consciousness work, etc. So I would hope that there is some effort to include that type of research in the AI research tools, because anomalies are always, in my opinion, anomalies are leading indicators of the change that's about to come, right? If an anomaly is persistent and it's not due to experimental error or something like that, it's telling you something. It's very, very high signal, right? And those are the things that we need to explore, because they're leading indicators, the types of breakthroughs that can be made. I mean, I'm no historian of science, but I know enough that many of the breakthroughs that we've had that are cornerstones of our current understanding of the world began their life as an anomaly, something that it didn't fit in the box. So we want to make sure that we include those.
Now, in terms of your own app, again, the Entangled app, and I'm going to urge people to visit entangled.org. Can anyone sign up for this? Can anyone get involved with this? I think you'd mentioned about 7,000 people are currently using this. If we do kind of I don't know what you would call it, a user drive, could we get more people involved? And is there a cost to use it or download it, or is this just kind of a free scientific research application?
Yeah, it's free. So anyone can join, and it's very easy. You would just go to the App Store, or go to the website, and you can download the app on your phone. It's free to create an account. There's minimal information on purpose. So it's just your phone number, which makes it fast to log in. And then you don't even have to give your real name. We don't track location. You can put in your city. You can put in any city you want, but you can put in your city, and then we'll match that on the back end to a system that will aggregate the individual's random number generator data and create a live map. So, like, one interpretation of that is it's a live map of consciousness. Another interpretation of that is it's just a live map of random number generators, but it's interesting to look at. The app will give users push notifications when their personal data is trending. A lot of people will find that data trends while they're doing something interesting.
Okay.
And then we'll do the same for cities. So for example, if there's 24 people in your city, we'll put that all together once an hour, analyze it all together, and we'll send a notification to people that live in that geo and saying, hey, there's something going on. And we'll do the same for the world as well. So that's Entangled now. That's kind of a beta v0. But I do hope to extend this in a number of different ways. One is to extend the number of formal experiments that we're doing. Earthquake prediction is cool, but there's a lot more that we could do. I'm interested, for example, in medical research. Right now, one of the bottlenecks to making medical breakthroughs is that there's so much data, it's hard to know where to look. But Entangled is one of those things where maybe the consciousness of the network of users can help narrow in on where to look in particular data sets or in the human genome that could tell some very open-minded investigator to maybe start your investigation here versus somewhere else. So I'm talking to a couple of labs that might participate in that one, but there are other things too. In addition to that, I hope to be able to open up questions by individual users that they can pose to the network and get answers.
Well, if it's okay, let me back up just a moment, because you mentioned the statistical map with the random number generators. Is Entangled driving RNGs based on those bits, or does it bypass the RNG in this case?
So the map is just looking, it's showing statistically significant deviations on a geographical basis.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't want to say that means that it's a map of global consciousness in a geo, because it might just be random. But the point is that there are interesting trends that may or may not correlate to things that are going on in your life, in your city, in the world. And because we're kind of focused on very structured questions, I leave that open to the interpretation of the users themselves.
Okay,
and the experiments are where we're getting more formal.
That makes sense. And actually, I'm a member of the Global Consciousness Project, GCP 2.0, and so I have an RNG system. I have one of the nodes in the house.
Cool.
Although interestingly, they have a map online where you can view basically the data and the output, and then they have color coding by how much it deviates. And I've noticed some of them do deviate significantly. Mine, it's almost kind of ironically humorous. Mine is always like absolutely dead normal all of the time, So I'm the normie in the room. I'm like absolutely average here in the Seattle area, but I'm happy to contribute and participate in that project. I think it's wonderful, and I believe in the goals. So just being able to help is a big thing. And with what you're doing with Entangled, it's the same thing. It's, I think we all want more information and answers, and we want definitive answers to these things. And now, with tools like you've developed, we're starting to find ways to get those. So again, I want to get people involved with this.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, so Adam, let me close by asking, well, first of all, again, I want to push entangled.org. You mentioned the app is free, so people at least need to view the website, learn more about what you're doing, and get involved. So I want to close with that. And I also want to ask, what is coming up for you in the next few months?
Well, I'm participating in a small symposium looking at sci effects and AI. That's in a couple weeks. And then I think, most of the conferences happen in the summer around these things. So and I guess I'm moving. I'm leaving Orange County and moving to Texas. So I've got a lot of life things that I've got to deal with. On the research side, though, I'll continue to plug away at Entangled and make updates as I can.
Amazing. Well, Adam, let me thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Oh, it was my pleasure.